Lila by Stephen Lauderdale, Chapter 1, The Road Watchers. The rain hammered against the windshield of Tank's rig, a relentless drumbeat that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. Route 17 stretched ahead in endless black, the pavement slick and glistening like the skin of some enormous, sleeping beast. The CB radio hissed with static, broken by occasional murmurs from distant truckers, most too occupied with the storm to chat. Tank wasn't the superstitious type, but even he had to admit something about this stretch of road felt wrong, like it was alive, watching. Then he saw her.
A lone figure on the shoulder, barely visible in the downpour, her soaked clothes clinging to her frame. A hitchhiker. Young, dark-haired, desperate.
Tank's gut twisted. He wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not at this hour, in this weather. But something about her, maybe the way she stood, shoulders curled inward, like she was trying to disappear, made him slow down. His headlights caught her fully, and his breath caught in his throat. She wasn't just drenched, she was pale, almost translucent. For a fraction of a second, he swore he could see the highway through her. Then she blinked, her body solid again, real as the rain pouring off her skin.
"Shit," Tank muttered, shaking his head. It was the storm. His eyes playing tricks. He wasn't getting enough sleep. Still, his foot hit the brake. The cab door opened, and the girl scrambled inside, her breath coming fast, knuckles white as she gripped the seat.
"Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would stop."
Tank threw the rig back into gear, hands steady even as his mind worked overtime. "Name's Tank," he said, handing her a towel from the back seat. "Where you headed?"
"Lila," she murmured, just keep driving."
Something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. Chapter 2, The Lies We Tell. The highway stretched ahead, dark and slick, swallowed by the storm. Tank kept his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind wasn't as steady. Lila sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in the towel had handed her, her dark hair still plastered to her face. She was trembling, but Tank wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. "You got family somewhere?" he asked, keeping his voice casual.
She hesitated. "No."
That hesitation sat wrong. Not just the pause, it was how she said it, like she was still deciding what the right answer should be. "Friends?"
Another pause. "Too long, not anymore."
The way she said it, like it had already been decided for her, made the muscles in Tank's back tighten. Lies. Had been on the road too long, met too many people, and there were some things you just knew. When people lied, they had a certain rhythm to it, like a song they were still learning the words to. Lila was singing that song now. But why? She had no luggage, no phone, not even a damn purse. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Nothing but the highway and the rain, but an unease coiled low in his gut. "You said you needed to get out of here," he said, watching her from the corner of his eye. "Out of where?"
Lila's grip tightened on the towel. "Just drive."
An ocean of black. "Stay put," Tank said, not trusting her enough to leave her alone with his truck keys. She just nodded, her face half lit by the dashboard glow. For a split second, her reflection in the rain-slick windshield looked wrong. Stretched. Too long. Tank blinked, and it was gone. Just the storm. Just fatigue. Inside, the gas station smelled like burnt coffee and cheap detergent. The attendant was a wiry guy in his 50s, wearing a grease-stained "Hi, my name is Steve" tag that looked like it hadn't been relevant in a decade. Tank grabbed a cup of coffee, then turned to the counter, and froze. Above Steve's head, written in dripping black ink on the wall, was a single word: liar. Tank's stomach dropped. He shot a glance at Steve, but the man just yawned, rubbing at his bloodshot eyes like nothing was wrong. No way. No damn way. Tank's mouth went dry. He took a slow step back, his breath coming faster. He looked around the store. No other customers. No sounds but the hum of the refrigerator units. He looked back at the wall. The word was gone, like it had never been there at all. Tank grabbed his coffee and walked back to the truck, his hands gripping the cup too tight. He climbed in and slammed the door. Lila barely reacted. She was staring out the window, face unreadable. Tank stared at her for a long moment.
"Lila," he said finally, his voice quieter than he meant. "What the hell are you?"
Her gaze flicked to him. Something in her eyes flashed, just for a second. A weight. Something ancient. Something that shouldn't be there. And then it was gone. Just a scared girl in the passenger seat. But Tank didn't believe that. Not anymore. Chapter 3. Reflections Never Lie. The storm had eased up by the time Tank pulled into the diner parking lot, but the air still felt thick, like the sky was holding its breath. Inside, the place was the usual kind of rundown. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a glowing breakfast served all day sign flickering behind the counter, a waitress with tired eyes stacking plates. Tank barely had time to put the truck in park before a heavy knock rattled the driver's side window. His gut twisted before he even turned to look. A trucker. Big guy, late 40s, rough-looking, but with a certain sharpness in his eyes. He gestured for Tank to roll the window down. Tank hesitated, then did.
"You got a hitchhiker with you?"
The man asked. His voice was flat, but there was something off about the way he said it. Tank felt Lila stiffen beside him.
"Yeah," he said slowly. "Why?"
The trucker didn't answer at first. He just leaned in, squinting past Tank. When he saw Lila, he went pale.
"Jesus Christ," he whispered. "It's you."
Lila's breath hitched. Tank saw it, her fingers curling into fists, the way her whole body tensed, like she was ready to bolt.
"You know her?"
Tank demanded. The trucker ignored him. He kept staring at Lila, like he was trying to make sense of something impossible.
"You shouldn't be here," he said, shaking his head. "You can't be here."
You're mistaken.
The trucker's eyes flicked back to Tank, and there was real fear there.
"Listen to me, man," he said. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but you need to get rid of her."
Tank's grip on the wheel tightened.
"She's just a hitchhiker."
The man let out a rough laugh, but there was no humor in it.
"Yeah, you sure about that?"
Not anymore. The trucker backed away.
"I ain't getting involved in this," he muttered. "But if you're smart, you'll leave her here and keep driving."
Then he was gone. Tank didn't speak as they entered the diner, didn't look at Lila, even when she kept sneaking glances at him. The place was mostly empty, aside from a couple old-timers nursing cups of coffee. A waitress in her 60s, name tag said Joanne, poured them water and handed them menus. Lila didn't touch hers, just stared at the laminated surface, shoulders drawn in. Tank finally spoke.
"What aren't you telling me?"
She didn't answer. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face.
"Look, I don't give a damn if you're running from someone, but I got a guy outside acting like you crawled out of his nightmares. What the hell is going on?"
I don't know, she murmured.
Joanne walked past just then, and she froze. Her tray clattered against the counter. Her breath came fast, uneven. Her eyes were locked onto Lila, like she'd just seen a ghost. Tank's skin prickled.
"You okay?"
He asked. Joanne didn't answer. Didn't even blink. Then, without looking away from Lila, she whispered,
She was dead.
Tank shot up from the booth, the air in the diner suddenly feeling too tight.
"What the hell is that supposed to mean?"
Joanne backed up a step, shaking her head.
I saw it. I saw her. We all did.
Lila looked pale now, paler than before. Joanne's hands trembled as she pointed.
You were on the news. They found your things. They said...
She stopped, swallowed. They said you died. The words hit like a gut punch. Tank looked at Lila, really looked at her. The trucker's warning, the way she'd hesitated answering questions. That damn word on the gas station wall. Liar. Tank's pulse roared in his ears.
"Is it true?"
Lila opened her mouth, but before she could speak, he saw something in the window's reflection. Not just him. Not just her. Something else. A figure. Dark. Twisted. Its mouth stretched into something too wide, teeth too sharp. And it was standing right behind them. Tank whirled around. Nothing, just the diner. Just the rain outside. His own reflection stared back at him from the window, breath fogging the glass. But not Lila's. Lila had no reflection. Chapter 4. The dead don't lie, but they do disappear. Tank gritted his teeth, his breath coming fast. His hands clenched on the edge of the table. Start talking, he said, voice low. Right now. Lila's fingers curled into the sleeves of her soaked hoodie. She didn't meet his eyes. Joanne was still standing there, her face pale as paper. Her hands trembled as she wiped them against her apron, like she could shake off whatever she'd just seen.
She was dead, Joanne murmured again, as if saying it out loud would make sense of it.
Tank shoved his chair back, the legs scraping against the linoleum. "That's not possible."
Joanne turned on him, eyes wide.
No, then how do you explain this?
The reflection in the window that wasn't there.
"Then the report was wrong," he said. But even as he said it, doubt curled in his gut.
Joanne swallowed hard. It wasn't just a report. They found her things, her blood, enough of it that they knew she didn't just wander off.
Tank's stomach turned. Lila still wasn't looking at him. He slammed his palm against the table, making both women flinch.
"Say something."
Lila's breath came in short, panicked bursts. Finally, she met his gaze. I don't remember.
Tank stared at her.
Bullshit.
She shook her head.
I don't.
Her voice cracked.
I know I was taken. I know I escaped. But after that, nothing. It's like I was floating. Like I wasn't here.
Tank's skin crawled. Joanne pressed a hand to her chest, whispering something under her breath. A prayer, maybe. Then the lights flickered. Tank's head snapped up. The diner had gone silent. The rain outside wasn't hitting the windows anymore. The old men at the counter weren't moving. They weren't even blinking. His pulse slammed against his ribs.
What the hell?
Lila grabbed his wrist. We need to go.
The shadows in the corners of the diner stretched, grew taller. One by one, the fluorescent lights buzzed out. Lila pulled him, and this time, Tank didn't fight it. The door to the diner felt farther away than it should have. The world outside the windows wasn't the world he had seen before. It was off. The wrong colors, the wrong shapes. It shifted, blurry, like a dream teetering on the edge of a nightmare. Then the door slammed open. The trucker from before, breathless, rain-soaked, holding a gun, and he was pointing it straight at Lila.
Get away from her!
He shouted. Tank's body locked up. Lila didn't move.
I said move!
The trucker's hands were shaking, his eyes wild with something close to terror. Joanne gasped, pressing herself against the counter.
Don't shoot.
Tank held up a hand.
Whoa now!
She's not what you think she is. The trucker's voice cracked. His finger twitched on the trigger. I saw what happened to the others. I saw what a light in the back of the diner, shattered. A deep, low hum filled the air. Lila turned to Tank, her face blank.
You need to choose,
she said softly. The trucker's hands trembled harder.
Don't listen to her.
Tank's breath came fast, his heart a hammer in his chest. He didn't know what was real anymore. All he knew was that something very bad was about to happen, and he was right in the middle of it. Chapter 5. The choice Tank had spent his whole damn life making the safe choice, keeping his head down, staying out of other people's business. This wasn't one of those times. He stepped in front of Lila. The trucker's gun stayed locked on her. His knuckles white, his breathing uneven.
Move?
He growled. Tank shook his head.
I don't think so.
The trucker's hands trembled.
Don't get it, man. You don't know what she is. Neither do you.
Tank shot back.
You said you saw something, but you don't know a damn thing. And I sure as hell don't shoot people just 'cause I don't understand them.
The trucker's face twisted. Lila stood behind Tank, silent, her breath soft against his back. Then she spoke, a whisper, a single word in a language that made the air bend. The trucker collapsed. He hit his knees, gasping, his gun clattering to the floor. His body shook like he'd been electrocuted, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His eyes were wide, too wide, like he'd seen something beyond the diner walls. Something terrible.
Tank's skin crawled. He turned to Lila, voice low. What the hell did you just do?
Lila didn't answer, because that's when Joanne screamed. Tank whirled around just in time to see her sprint for the door, and just in time to see something grab her. The thing outside the diner wasn't human. It wasn't even pretending to be. It was long, its limbs too thin, its fingers wrapping around Joanne's shoulders like a puppet master finding its strings. And its face, Tank's stomach twisted. It had no face, just a blank, shifting void, like something had erased it from existence. Joanne thrashed, screamed, but the sound warped like it was being pulled away.
Tank lunged forward.
Too late. The thing yanked her into the darkness. The diner door slammed shut behind her. And then, silent. The trucker was still on his knees, whispering to himself, his eyes unfocused. Lila stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides.
Tank swallowed the bile in his throat and turned to her. What, he said, voice shaking, the hell was that?
Lila exhaled slowly. They found us.
Tank took a step closer.
Lila lifted her head. Her dark eyes were wide, terrified.
The people who took me, she whispered.
Tank's pulse slammed against his ribs. Lila turned to the window. Outside, the world was wrong. The streetlights weren't in the right places. The trucks in the lot had changed. The rain was falling upward. Like they weren't in the same world anymore. Like something had moved them. And whatever it was, it wanted them to stay. Chapter 6. The road that wasn't there. Tank's breath came fast, shallow. His hands shook. He didn't know what the hell was happening. He didn't want to know. He just knew one thing. They had to leave. Now.
Lila grabbed his arm. Tank?
He ignored her, yanking open the diner door, and stopped dead. The parking lot was gone. No, not gone. Changed. The road wasn't Route 17 anymore. The pavement had cracks in all the wrong places. like it had been broken and patched back together by someone who didn't understand how roads worked. The yellow lines twisted and bent, vanishing into the horizon like something had been stretched. And the sky wasn't right. It was deep, endless black. Not the kind of black you got at night, but the kind of black you got when there was nothing beyond it. A void, a dead channel, and the stars weren't stars. They were eyes, watching. Tank took a slow step back. His boots scraped against the diner floor. He turned to Lila, and for the first time, she actually looked scared.
I told you, she whispered. They found us.
Behind them, the trucker moved. Tank didn't turn around. He could hear it, the creak of bones bending wrong, the wet sound of something that wasn't supposed to be alive breathing. Then a voice, but not his voice. Tank had spent enough time on the road to recognize things that didn't belong. And whatever was speaking now, it wasn't human. You took what was ours, the voice rasped. Tank turned. The trucker was standing now. Barely. His joints shouldn't have bent that way. His head twitched, his mouth working like a puppet's. His eyes, they weren't his anymore. They were black, all black. He took a jerking step forward. You, his voice stuttered, glitched, like a scratched record. You don't belong here.
Tank grabbed Lila's arm. We're leaving.
She didn't move. Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists.
Tank, she whispered. I think I remember now.
The air in the diner shifted. Tank could feel it. A heaviness, a pull, like whatever had grabbed Joanne wasn't done yet. Like it was still here.
Lila swallowed hard. I wasn't kidnapped.
Tank's mouth went dry.
I mean, I was, but not by people. Her voice trembled. Not exactly.
The trucker took another step. His breath rattled. You ran, he whispered. Lila flinched. Tank reached for the knife he kept on his belt, even though deep down, he knew it wouldn't do a damn thing. The trucker tilted his head, eyes like twin voids. Lila's breath hitched.
Tank turned to her. What does he mean?
Lila's lip trembled. She turned her gaze to the diner window. Tank followed her line of sight, and his stomach dropped. Their reflections were wrong. Lila's face in the glass was pale, hollow, her eyes were sunken, dark. Tank's reflection, it wasn't moving. He lifted a hand. His reflection stayed still. Then slowly, too slowly, it smiled. Chapter 7, What She Left Behind. Tank couldn't move. His reflection, his own goddamn face, had stepped back from the glass. And it was still watching him. Still smiling. Lila's reflection was worse. It wasn't just sunken and hollow, it was rotting. Her eyes were black pits. Her lips peeled back over teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. Her skin was peeling in places, like something had crawled out of her instead of the other way around. Tank's pulse thundered in his ears.
What the hell is this?
Lila's breath came in shaky bursts. This is what I left behind.
Tank wrenched his gaze away from the glass, grabbing her arm.
Start talking, he growled.
Lila swallowed hard. I don't remember all of it, but I know I wasn't just taken. I think I died.
Tank went cold.
No.
Lila's voice cracked. I think I died, Tank, or at least part of me did.
She turned back to the glass, staring at the thing that wore her face.
I think I left something behind when I escaped.
Tank's stomach twisted. Lila wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a normal girl either. She was something in between. Something half here, half gone. The trucker's voice rasped behind them. They want you back. Tank turned, knife in hand. The trucker's body was wrong. His limbs twitched in sharp, unnatural movements. His head lolled. His blackened eyes flicked to Lila. You don't belong here.
Lila's hands clenched into fists, I know.
A sound rumbled through the diner, low and guttural. Like laughter, Tank felt it in his bones. It wasn't coming from the trucker. It was coming from the walls. The diner warped. The windows bent inward. The floor breathed beneath their feet, swelling and sinking like a lung. The booth stretched long and thin, the neon sign flickering in and out of existence. A blackened hand pressed against the inside of the window.
Tank grabbed Lila. We're leaving now.
Lila's eyes were locked on the glass. The figure inside was whispering, and her lips were moving with it.
Tank shook her. Lila, look at me!
She gasped, blinking like she was waking up from a dream. The truck. They needed the truck. Tank bolted for the door, dragging her behind him. The second he hit the pavement, the air shifted. The parking lot wasn't right. The trucks weren't where they'd been before. The signs had changed. The words twisted. Letters jumbled. And the road? The road wasn't there at all. Just endless, yawning black. Chapter 8. The Thing That Crawled. The trucker's body jerked. Tank barely had time to process it before the man seized, his mouth stretching open in a way no human jaw should ever move. and something crawled out. It was long, wet, its body slick like it had been gestating in there. Black, sinewy limbs peeled away from the trucker's throat, curling as it dragged itself free.
Tank shoved Lila back.
The thing, whatever the hell it was, didn't have a face. Just a hole where its head should have been, a shifting, yawning void that seemed to pulse. The trucker collapsed like a dropped marionette, his body useless now. The thing turned toward them, unfolding as it rose. And then it spoke. Not in words, not with sound. It echoed inside Tank's skull. "You stole what was ours." Tank reeled, the words buzzing in his teeth, his head screaming. Beside him, Lila gasped, stumbling like she'd been hit. She clutched her head. "Tank, we have to." The thing lurched forward. Tank barely had time to pull Lila out of the way before its two long limbs swept through the air where they had been standing. The ground cracked beneath its touch. Tank's stomach flipped. It wasn't just attacking. It was unraveling reality. The truck was the only option.
Tank yanked Lila toward the rig, throwing open the door and shoving her inside.
The thing behind them twisted, its faceless void shifting, moving like it was watching without eyes. "You can't run."
Tank slammed the door and floored it.
The rig roared to life, tires screeching as they shot forward, and straight into nothing. The highway was gone. No Route 17, no pavement. Just blackness, endless, stretching blackness. Tank's knuckles turned white on the wheel. Jesus Christ. Lila's breath was ragged. Then she started bleeding. Her nose, her ears, a thin red line trailing from the corner of her eye. Tank's pulse spiked. "Lila?" She swayed in her seat, clutching her head. "They're pulling me back." Tank's stomach sank. She wasn't bleeding because she was hurt. She was unraveling. Chapter 9. When something else takes notice. Tank's grip on the wheel was iron tight, his pulse hammering. The truck shouldn't have been driving. There was nothing under the tires. No road, no highway, just an endless void stretching in all directions. And Lila was bleeding out of nowhere. She clutched her head, her breath coming fast. "Tank!"
His voice came out like gravel. "You are not leaving me, you hear me?"
She was unraveling, but he wouldn't let her go. Something else did that. A sound rumbled through the cab. Deep, a vibration that hummed in Tank's ribs, made the world tilt.
Lila sucked in a sharp breath, eyes wide. Oh, God.
The headlights flickered. Tank barely had time to react before the darkness shifted. Something else was out there. And it was big. The void moved. It wasn't empty anymore. Shapes coiled in the distance, twisting like living shadows. Limbs stretching too far. Bodies shifting in and out of focus like they couldn't quite decide what they were. And they were looking at him. The voices started. Not words, not sounds. Thoughts. "You are not part of this. You should not be here. This is not your burden."
Tank's teeth clenched. "I don't care."
Lila turned to him, eyes wide, horrified. "Tank, stop!"
"No," he snapped. "I don't leave people behind."
She shook her head, desperate. "This isn't like that. You don't understand."
The road appeared. Tank barely had time to register it before the tires hit asphalt again. The real world slammed into place like a bad film reel stuttering back into motion. They were back on Route 17. But something felt wrong. Lila's breathing hitched. She turned, staring out the window. Tank followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. The highway was lined with figures, still, watching. And they weren't human, not anymore. The air was thick, charged with something he couldn't name. Lila's hands trembled. She whispered something under her breath. Tank barely heard her. Then she turned to him, her face ashen. Her voice was small.
"They see you now."
Tank's blood ran cold.
"What?"
Lila swallowed. "They see you. They see you. You weren't supposed to be involved."
Tank's skin prickled. A realization clawed up his spine. Head made a choice. Head refused to let Lila go, and something else had taken interest. Not just in her, in him.
Chapter 10. The reflection that wasn't his Tank's. Hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The road was back. They were back. But something was wrong. The air inside the cab felt thick, pressing against his skin like static before a lightning strike. Lila was pale, shaking, eyes darting to the roadside figures that weren't moving. But Tank wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at the windshield, and his reflection was looking back at him, smiling. Tank's stomach dropped, because he wasn't smiling. His face in the glass was wrong, too sharp, too stretched, teeth too white, eyes too black. And it wasn't copying him. It blinked when he didn't. It tilted its head, studying him. Then it lifted a hand. Tank's breath caught in his throat as his reflection moved on its own. It tapped against the glass once, twice, a slow, patient rhythm. Tank's chest went tight. He didn't move, and then his reflection leaned in close, its mouth stretching wider, and it spoke. No sound, just words forming on its lips. Tank understood them anyway. "You should have let her go." Then the glass cracked, a thin webbing fracture spreading from the inside. Tank jerked the wheel. Lila gasped, grabbing the dash as the truck swerved. The reflection, his not reflection, just kept grinning, and then, as the crack splintered deeper, it vanished. Tank pulled to the side of the road, heart pounding. His hands were shaking. Lila was watching him.
"Tank," she whispered.
He was still staring at the windshield. The glass looked normal again. No cracks, no grin, no wrongness. But he knew. It had been real. Slowly, he turned to Lila. His voice came out rough.
"What the hell did I just see?"
Lila licked her lips, looking sick.
"That wasn't you."
Tank's pulse hammered.
"No kidding."
She swallowed. "That was the part of you that they want."
His stomach sank.
"What?"
Lila hesitated, like she wasn't sure how much she should say. Tank leaned in.
She exhaled shakily. "They don't just take people.
Tank waited.
They take pieces of people," she whispered. Her gaze flicked to the windshield, to replace the ones they lost.
Tank's blood went cold. Something in him was missing now. And something else, something not him, had taken its place. Chapter 11. The Thing That Wore His Face. Tank's skin crawled. Lila had said they took pieces of people. But when he turned his gaze back to the highway, he realized something much worse. They didn't just take pieces, they replaced them, because one of them had his face. Tank's breath hitched, his body went rigid, his grip on the wheel iron tight. There, standing perfectly still on the roadside, was him. Same broad-shouldered frame, same worn-out leather jacket, same face. But the eyes were all wrong. Not black like the trucker's had been, not hollow like Lila's reflection, just empty, flat, a mask of him without the thing that made it real. And then it moved. Tank's stomach twisted. The thing wearing his face turned its head, slow and deliberate. Then it stepped onto the road, toward them. Tank's breath caught, his pulse spiked. It moved like him, the same weight in its steps, the same broad, easy gait. But it wasn't him. It was an echo, a hollowed-out copy, and it was coming closer. Lila's fingers dug into the seat.
"Tank."
He threw the truck into gear. The rig roared forward, and the thing with his face, smiled. Tank barely kept the truck steady. The rig's tires screeched as it tore forward, the massive frame rattling under the sudden burst of speed. He didn't look back, didn't dare, but he could feel it. That thing, that wrong thing, still watching. And then, the CB radio crackled. Tank's stomach lurched. A voice came through, a familiar voice.
"You can't outrun yourself."
Tank's throat went dry, because the voice, it was his own. Chapter 12, What They Took. The CB hissed. The road stretched ahead. Tank could feel his own voice whispering through the static, taunting him, but he ignored it. Lila's fingers dug into the seat. She was staring ahead, her face pale.
"You need to find it," she whispered.
Tank's grip tightened on the wheel. "Find what?"
Lila turned to him, eyes dark.
"What they took from you."
Tank's pulse thundered. His head was a mess, too many things happening at once. The truck stop, the gas station, the reflection that wasn't his. And now there was a thing out there with his face. He forced himself to focus.
"Lila, I don't even know what's missing."
"You wouldn't," she said softly. "That's the point."
Tank's stomach churned. A cold, sinking realization hit him. It was like trying to remember a dream that had already faded. A piece of himself he couldn't quite name. But the emptiness was there, waiting. The truck barreled forward, cutting through the dark. The road ahead was changing. Not physically, no twists, no warps, but subtly. Tank's gut told him that this wasn't Route 17 anymore. It looked the same, felt the same, but it wasn't. Lila was watching him carefully.
"You still don't feel it?" she asked.
Tank shook his head. "Feel what?"
Lila exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something is missing in you, Tank."
"What now?"
Lila's hands curled into fists. "They're trying to keep you from remembering," she whispered.
Tank's breath came faster. If they didn't want him to remember, then maybe that's exactly what he needed to do. Chapter 13. The Memory That Wasn't Lost. Lila turned to him, her eyes wide, full of something. Tank couldn't quite name. Fear? Desperation? Regret? She reached out, hesitated, then placed her fingers against his forehead. The moment her skin touched his, everything snapped loose. The truck was gone. The road was gone. Tank was somewhere else, somewhere cold, a place that smelled like damp earth and burning metal. The sky was a deep, endless black just like before, but this time it was closer, heavy, pressing against his chest like it wanted inside his ribs. And he wasn't alone. Figures surrounded him, tall, wrong. They didn't move, but he knew they were watching. And in the middle of them, Lila. Her clothes were torn, her arms streaked with dried blood. She wasn't standing, she was floating. A thin, invisible thread stretched from her body into the dark. She was tied to something, something that wasn't here, something that was watching him too. Tank tried to move, and that's when he saw it. The thing that was him, standing just outside the circle, same face, same build, same everything, but empty, waiting, and then it stepped forward and ripped something out of his chest. Tank snapped back to reality with a gasp. His body jerked against the seat, his pulse thundering in his ears. The truck was still moving. Lila was still beside him, but something in him had shifted. He could feel the hole now. He didn't know what had been taken, but it was his, and they had stolen it. He turned to Lila, breathless. "You knew."
Lila didn't answer.
Didn't deny it. She just nodded.
And then she whispered, "Now you understand."
Chapter 14, The Piece They Stole. Tank's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling like he'd just sprinted a mile. He felt it now, that missing piece, that thing they'd ripped away from him. And it wasn't just a memory, it was something else, something they needed back. Lila was still watching him, her expression unreadable.
"You know now, don't you?"
Tank swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. He clenched his fists, trying to put the feeling into words. It wasn't like losing a memory, like forgetting a name or a place. It was like losing a limb, like some invisible part of him had been torn out. And now, he could feel the weight of the absence.
Lila's voice was barely a whisper. "They can't take from nothing."
Tank's fingers twitched against the wheel. What does that mean?
Lila exhaled shakily. "They don't steal things at random. They can't take what you don't have to give."
Tank gritted his teeth. So what did I give them?
Lila's eyes darkened.
"You didn't give it." Her voice came softer now. "They took it."
Tank's stomach sank, because suddenly he knew. It wasn't just a memory. It was a promise, a deal had never agreed to, and now they were waiting for him to honor it. The truck barreled down the road, but Tank didn't feel like he was in control anymore. He wasn't sure he had ever been. Lila's fingers twisted in her lap, her breath uneven.
"They want it back, Tank."
He stared ahead, jaw tight.
Yeah?
She nodded.
"They'll come for you soon."
Tank's pulse hammered. Then he said the only thing that made sense anymore.
Then let him come.
Chapter 15, The End of the Road. The truck lurched. Tank's foot slammed the brakes before his brain had even caught up. Because up ahead, there was nothing. The road just stopped. Just a sheer impossible drop-off into a black, yawning abyss. The tires screeched. The rig shuddered, the weight of the trailer making it fishtail before finally coming to a grinding halt. Tank's hands clenched the wheel. His breath was shallow. Beside him, Lila's lips parted. Because there, standing at the very edge of the void, was someone waiting for them. Tank's stomach dropped. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing, still, patient, like it had been here the whole time. The headlights barely touched it, like the darkness around it was swallowing the light. Tank's heart hammered. He knew, before he even got out, that it was waiting for him. Not Lila, him. Lila's breath was shaky.
"They're done waiting?"
Tank exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. They want their piece back.
Lila didn't answer, because they both knew the truth now. It wasn't just that they had taken something from him. They had given him something too. And now, the deal had come due. Chapter 16, Face to Face with the End. Tank took a slow breath. He didn't want to do this. Every instinct screamed, turn the rig around, get the hell out of here. But that wasn't an option, was it? This wasn't a road you could run from. This was a road you either walked to the end of, or a road that swallowed you whole. So Tank did the only thing left. He opened the door and stepped out. The air was thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him. The pavement didn't feel right under his boots. It was too soft, like he was walking on something that wasn't really there. The figure at the edge didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, the blackness stretching out behind it, endless and yawning. Tank's chest was tight.
All right, he muttered, him here.
Nothing. The figure just watched. Tank took another step. The figure tilted its head, slow, deliberate. Then it spoke, and Tank heard his own voice. A chill raced down his spine.
Tank's hands curled into fists. Remember what?
The figure took a single step forward. The headlights behind him barely touched it, like the darkness around it was swallowing everything, bending reality itself.
What we agreed to.
Tank's pulse spiked. Something in his chest tightened, a deep, gnawing pull. Like whatever had been taken from him was trying to drag itself back.
Tank's jaw clenched. I never agreed to anything.
The figure's grin was slow, knowing.
You did.
Tank's blood ran cold, because deep down, he knew it was right. Somewhere, long before he'd forgotten, he had made a deal, and now it was time to pay. Chapter 17, What They Came to Take. The figure reached forward. Slow. Tank's breath hitched, because the second that outstretched hand got too close, something inside him moved. It was a pull, not physical, not like a punch or a shove. It was deeper, like something under his ribs, something in his bones, something that wasn't fully part of him anymore. Tearing free, Tank staggered back, a deep ache blooming in his chest. His lungs tightened, his knees buckled, like whatever they had taken from him was trying to leave him again. And this time, they weren't asking.
Lila's voice cut through the air. Tank!
He could barely hear her. The world around him blurred, his vision tilting, warping. The figure stepped forward. The pull grew stronger. Tank's breath came shaky now, his body fighting to hold on to something. Something he didn't even remember losing. And then, he saw it, not with his eyes, not with anything he could explain, but he saw it, what they had taken, and it wasn't a memory. It wasn't a name. It wasn't just a piece of him. It was his way out, his choice. He was never getting it back. The hand was inches from his chest. The pull was too strong now. Tank's muscles locked. His body wanted to give in. Let it go. Let them take it. Let the deal be done. His vision darkened at the edges. He felt himself slipping. And then Lila grabbed his wrist, and everything snapped back into focus. Tank gasped, his lungs flooding with air again. The figure jerked back, its hand recoiling like it had been burned.
Lila's grip on him tightened. Her voice was low, shaking. Don't you dare let them have it.
Tank's head was still spinning, his pulse wild, but one thing was clear now. They hadn't just taken from him. They had left a hole, a gap that they were trying to make permanent. If he let them take the rest, if he let them finish the job, he wasn't walking away from this. Not ever. Tank's jaw locked, his fists clenched, and for the first time since this nightmare started, he knew exactly what he had to do. Chapter 18, The Other Way Out. Tank's breath came fast and uneven, his chest still aching from the pull of whatever the hell had just tried to take him apart. The figure at the edge of the abyss stood motionless, but it wasn't retreating. It was waiting, like it knew something he didn't. Like it had all the time in the world.
Tank clenched his fists. No, they weren't taking another damn thing from him.
But before he could charge forward, before he could fight for what was his,
Lila grabbed his arm. There's another way, she whispered.
Tank's body locked up.
Another way?
He turned to her, pulse still hammering.
Then tell me fast.
Lila hesitated just for a second too long, because whatever was standing at the end of the road. It laughed, a slow, low vibration that wasn't sound. It was felt deep in the ribs.
Tank gritted his teeth. Lila?
She looked at him, eyes too wide, too knowing.
Tank's jaw tightened. Like hell I can't.
Lila shook her head. That's not how this works.
She glanced back at the thing watching them, at the void stretching behind it.
You didn't just lose something, Tank. You were supposed to give it away.
Tank felt something cold slide through him, like ice water dripping down his spine. She took a breath.
And if you take it back, she said softly, you have to give them something else instead.
The words hit like a hammer. Tank staggered back. A trade. They hadn't just taken something from him. They'd taken something in exchange for something else. And if he took back what was his, something else had to replace it.
His hands tightened into fists. That's not a choice.
Lila swallowed hard. It's the only one you have.
Tank's pulse roared in his ears. He turned back to the figure, watching him with that empty, patient gaze. Waiting, because it knew that Tank had to decide. Knew that either way, they won. But Tank had spent his whole damn life letting other people make choices for him. Not this time. His jaw set.
Then I choose, he said.
And he took a step forward. Chapter 19, Refusing the Trade. Tank stood his ground. The figure at the edge of the void waited, its form barely illuminated by the truck's headlights. The thing had expected him to give in. To bargain, to trade. But Tank didn't bargain with things like this. His voice came out low and steady.
No.
The air around them shifted, the weight of reality pressing in. The figure tilted its head, slow and deliberate. Then for the first time it moved, a single step forward, then another. Then it stopped, watching, waiting, like it was giving him one last chance. But Tank didn't move, didn't blink, didn't waver. His fists tightened at his sides.
Whatever you took from me, you don't get to keep it. And you don't get another piece of me either.
A silence fell. Deep, heavy. Then the thing laughed. It was a sound that wasn't a sound. It buzzed in the bones, a vibration that didn't belong in this world. Tank gritted his teeth as the weight of it pushed against him.
Lila grabbed his sleeve, her fingers ice cold. Tank?
The figure's laughter stopped, and then it spoke.
You don't understand.
Tank's chest tightened. The thing took another slow step forward.
This was never about you taking it back.
Tank's fingers twitched toward his knife.
This was about whether or not you would leave it behind.
Tank's pulse spiked. Something in his mind, something buried, stolen, lurched. Lila's grip on his sleeve tightened.
Tank, she whispered. They never planned to let you go.
And that's when the road started to fall apart. Chapter 20. The Unseen Player. The road cracked beneath them. The void stretched wider, creeping forward like a living thing. Lila's grip on Tank's arm tightened.
We need to run.
Then something else stepped forward. Something that shouldn't have been there. And the figure at the edge of the road? For the first time, it hesitated. Tank's breath hitched. The new presence wasn't like the others. It didn't come from the void. It didn't feel like them. But it wasn't human either. It wasn't anything Tank could understand. It was just there, watching. The space around it warped, like it didn't fully exist in one place at a time. It had no face, no shape, just a shifting form that unraveled and reformed like smoke caught in slow motion. And when it spoke, it wasn't words. It was thoughts. A pressure against Tank's mind, deep and ancient.
This game has gone on too long.
The figure at the edge of the void froze. For the first time, it didn't look in control anymore. Tank felt it. The shift. The sudden imbalance of power. This new thing, it was bigger than the rules the figure had been playing by. And it had just changed the game. Lila's breathing was shaky. She knew something, but she wasn't saying it yet. Tank didn't care. He turned to the shifting form, heart pounding.
What the hell are you?
The thing didn't answer, but the figure at the void's edge stepped back, one step, then another. A slow, deliberate retreat. Tank's pulse slammed. They had been so sure of themselves before, so confident. And now, they were afraid. Tank's jaw locked. And then, for the first time since this nightmare started, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. Chapter 21. What Lila Knows. The shifting presence stood still, its form flickering like something half-existing, half-remembered. The figure at the void's edge had stepped back, but it hadn't left. It was waiting. And Tank? He was waiting too, because Lila knew something, and it was time she started talking. Tank turned to her, breath still ragged, heart hammering.
Lila?
She flinched, but didn't look away from the shifting form.
You know what this thing is, he said, don't you?
Lila's hands clenched into fists. For a long, tense moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she nodded. Tank's stomach sank.
Start talking.
Lila exhaled slow and shaky.
I don't know what to call it, she murmured, but I know what it does.
Which is?
Lila's eyes flickered toward the figure at the edge of the void. The one that had been so sure of itself. The one that had taken from Tank without asking. The one that was stepping backward now.
This thing, she whispered, motioning toward the shifting presence, doesn't play their game.
Tank's pulse spiked. She swallowed hard.
It ends it.
The figure at the void's edge didn't move forward again. It was watching, waiting, calculating. Tank wasn't sure these things could feel fear, but if they could, it was feeling it now. The new presence shifted again, its form flickering like it was adjusting, stretching its awareness across more than just the space they stood in. Tank had no idea what it was thinking, but it was clear as hell that the rules had changed. And whatever the void creatures had been doing before, they weren't in control anymore. Tank's jaw locked.
Then why is it helping us?
Lila hesitated. Her fingers twisted together, like she didn't want to say it out loud. Then soft, almost too quiet to hear.
It doesn't like unfinished business.
Chapter 22. The ending it chose. The air shifted. The presence, whatever it was, didn't wait for Tank's answer. It didn't ask. It just moved. And the world moved with it. Tank felt it hit him first. Not a physical impact, but a force, like something had reached into his bones and pulled. The road tilted, the void twisted. The thing standing at its edge jerked backward like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Lila gasped, stumbling as the truck, the whole damn world, seemed to bend inward. Tank's stomach dropped. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a fight. This thing, the one that had come for them, the one that had scared even the monsters of the void, was rewriting everything. The figure at the void's edge tried to move forward, but it was too late. It was being pulled back, dragged into the blackness it had once controlled. Its voice wasn't words anymore. It was anger, panic, like it had been cheated. Like it had played a game it was never meant to lose, and yet, it lost. The void collapsed inward, pulling its creatures, its unfinished trades, its stolen things into its own undoing. Tank's ears rang. His body felt too heavy, like gravity had tripled, then vanished entirely. And then, everything went black. When Tank woke up, the first thing he heard was rain. Not the thick, deafening downpour from before, not the unnatural, distorted storm that had followed them. Just rain. Steady. Real. Normal. His fingers twitched against the wheel. He was in the truck. Still in the truck. The headlights illuminated the road ahead. A real road, Route 17. And Lila? She was in the seat beside him, staring out the window. Her breath was even, her hands solid. She was still here, and so was he. Tank's pulse slammed against his ribs.
Lila?
The time. He swallowed hard and flicked his gaze to the dashboard. The clock read
7 a.m.
Tank's breath caught. That was impossible. The storm, the gas station, the diner, the figures at the road's edge, the deal, all of it. It should have been hours, a whole night. But the clock hadn't moved. Not even a second. Tank's stomach turned. Slowly, he reached for his phone, pressed the power button. The screen lit up.
3:07 a.m.
Tank's fingers went tight around the device.
Lila.
His voice was rough, low. She turned, her dark eyes unreadable. He held the phone up.
Tell me you see this.
Lila's gaze flicked to the screen. For the briefest moment, something crossed her face. A flicker of understanding, a flicker of fear. Then she nodded.
Yeah.
Tank's jaw locked. The road looked right. The truck felt real, but time hadn't moved. And that meant maybe they hadn't either. Chapter 24. Proving it's real. Tank's pulse hammered. His whole body felt wrong, like his skin fit too tight, like his brain was half a second out of sync with reality. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. But the clock hadn't moved. And that wasn't normal. So he did the only thing that made sense. He pulled over. The truck rumbled as it eased onto the shoulder, tires crunching against damp gravel. Tank killed the engine. The world went still. No CB radio crackle, no voices in the dark. Just the soft, steady sound of rain tapping against the windshield. Tank exhaled, slow and controlled. Then he turned to Lila.
Come on.
She didn't argue, didn't ask why. She just opened the door and stepped out. The rain was cold, real. The wind brushed against Tank's skin, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs. It felt right. It felt human. Tank took a slow step forward. His boots sank slightly into wet gravel. He let out a slow, measured breath. Everything felt normal. But still, his gut twisted. Something was off. And he had a terrible feeling he was about to find out what. Lila stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself. She looked real. She felt real. Tank ran a hand down his face.
All right, if this is real, if we're really back.
He turned toward the road, toward the nearest signpost, a mile marker, something that would prove they were home. He took a step forward and stopped cold. His stomach dropped, because the sign didn't say Route 17. It said, Welcome to Black Hollow. Tank's breath caught in his throat. Black Hollow? That was impossible. Because Black Hollow didn't exist anymore. It was a ghost town, burned to the ground 20 years ago. Tank turned to Lila, chest tight. She was staring at the sign, her face pale. He swallowed hard.
Lila?
He murmured.
Where the hell are we?
She didn't answer, because she didn't know either. Chapter 25. The night Lila died. Tank's stomach twisted. The road sign shouldn't exist. The town shouldn't exist. And yet, here they were. Lila hadn't said a word. She was still staring at the sign, her breath too shallow, her hands curled into tight fists. Tank turned toward her, his voice low, measured.
Lila.
She flinched but didn't look away.
Tell me,
he said.
All of it.
Her fingers tightened. For a long, tense moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she exhaled. And she told him the truth. It started in Black Hollow, before it burned, before it was erased, before it was forgotten. Lila's voice was quiet, her words carefully chosen.
I was here
she murmured.
the night it happened.
Tank's chest tightened.
The night what happened?
She swallowed hard.
The night they tried to trade me.
Tank felt the words sink in, heavy, final. Lila's gaze flickered toward the empty town ahead.
I don't remember all of it,
She admitted.
but I remember enough.
Tank stayed silent. Let her keep going. Lila took a shaky breath.
There was a cult here. I don't know how long they'd been doing it, but I know I wasn't the first. They picked hitchhikers, people who wouldn't be missed, people who could disappear.
Her throat bobbed as she swallowed.
I was supposed to be next.
Tank felt a deep, burning rage coil in his gut, a slow, suffocating fury. Not at Lila, at them, at the people who'd taken her, at the monsters that had used this road as a hunting ground. Tank exhaled through his nose.
But you got away.
Lila hesitated. Then she shook her head.
No,
She murmured.
I didn't.
Tank's blood ran cold. Lila turned to him, eyes dark, haunted.
I died that night, Tank.
The words hit him like a hammer. He felt them deep in his ribs. Because she wasn't lying. And that meant everything they'd seen, everything they'd survived, had all led back to this. Lila's hands trembled at her sides.
They didn't kill me the way you'd think.
She whispered.
It wasn't a knife or a gun.
Tank stayed silent.
They were trying to open something.
Lila's voice was hollow.
A door, a connection. I was the key.
Tank's jaw tightened. She took a shaky breath.
And it worked.
Tank's pulse roared.
They got what they wanted.
Lila whispered.
I got pulled through,
Tank's fingers twitched.
but I fought.
She murmured.
I didn't want to stay on their side.
Her gaze locked onto his.
That's why I'm here, Tank.
A slow, horrible realization settled in his chest.
I came back,
Lila's voice cracked.
but I didn't come back alone.
Chapter 26. What came back with her? Tank's breath was steady now. Not calm, not at peace, but ready. Because if Lila had come back and Shed brought something else with her, then it was time to figure out what the hell that thing was. Lila swallowed hard, her fingers digging into her sleeves.
I thought I escaped,
She murmured.
but I think
Her voice dropped to a whisper.
I was just let go.
Just a memory, or a piece of his soul, or a simple trade. They were trying to replace Lila with him. Finish the bargain. Lila had escaped her fate, and in doing so, she had tipped the scales. Now, the void needed a replacement. That's why they had let him go this far. That's why they had taken something from him, because they wanted to know if he would be willing to take her place. And Tank, he had a decision to make. Chapter 27. The Last Stand. Tank squared his shoulders.
No.
The word rippled through the air. The town shuddered, the blackness around them trembling. The unseen force that had been hunting them, manipulating them. It was waiting for his answer. And it had just gotten it. Tank wasn't taking her place. And that meant there was only one thing left to do. Chapter 28. Breaking the cycle. Lila had been the key once. She had been the anchor, the thing that kept the doorway open. But now, Tank was going to be the one to slam it shut. Together, they headed into Black Hollow. The streets were frozen in time, just as they had been before the fire. The cult's final ritual site, the place where Lila had died, was still there, waiting. Tank and Lila stood in the center of it, staring into the blackness that had nearly swallowed them both. And then, they lit the whole damn town on fire. Chapter 29. The fire that set them free. Black Hollow had been burned before. But that fire, it had been meant to cover up the truth. This one?
This fire was meant to end it.
As the flames roared, Tank felt the missing piece inside him return. They had taken it to make him part of their game. Now, he was taking it back. The town collapsed in on itself, the buildings warping, the ritual circle cracking apart. And in the flames, Tank swore he saw the thing that had been waiting for them. Not as a god, not as an entity, but as a failed gamble. Because they had broken the rules. They had burned the board. There was no deal to finish anymore. Epilogue. Back on the road, Tank and Lila drove, just drove. No missing time, no whispers in the dark, no reflections staring back at him with a different smile, just the road ahead. Lila exhaled, staring out the window. She was really here, whole, alive.
Tank?
Gripped the wheel, steady. The CB radio crackled, nothing strange. Just the usual trucker chatter. For the first time in a long time, everything was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, Tank thought maybe, just maybe, they had actually won. Final line, the road ahead. As the rig rumbled down the highway, Lila turned to him.
What now?
She asked.
Wherever the road takes us.
And for the first time, that didn't scare him one bit. The end.